Hello, today we're speaking with Liron Brish, co-founder and CEO of Farmdog. Welcome to the podcast, Liron.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it.
Very good. To start, could you tell us a little bit about Farmdog?
Yeah, so Farmdog's overarching mission is to provide transparency in the new sustainable supply chain for agriculture. Where we decided to start was on the pest and disease side, and really providing growers and agronomists a simple tool to improve their operations, meaning time savings, improved communication. As they're doing that, we're able to build out a database of in-field observations, and then, of course, run our data science on top of that to provide longer-term value, such as agronomic insights, such as which treatments are working well or less well, what's going on in your area, with the ultimate goal, of course, to help growers reduce their pesticide use, maintain or improve their yields, and promote environmental sustainability.
And I suppose what drove the initial decision to start Farmdog?
Yeah, so my background is what I call kind of the three-headed Cerberus dog from hell. I studied finance undergrad, University of Texas, then studied law at NYU in New York, and then went to consulting at McKinsey, working around the world with grocery store chains and some tech companies. And really, at a certain point, it got to my desire to do two things. One is to be my own boss. I was tired of consulting and providing advice and then letting somebody run off and do whatever they think is at the end of the day best. I wanted to own the problem and I wanted to own the solution. And the second aspect, really, I just wanted to get my hands dirty, right? Finance, law, and consulting, you become a Microsoft Office wizard, but your hands aren't dirty. And I just really wanted to work on something tangible that also had the ultimate kind of goal of pushing sustainability forward.
And so as part of that, did you have a pretty kind of wide scope in terms of the problems you were looking to solve, or were you kind of drawn to agriculture from the beginning?
It was pretty widespread. It was one of those horrible stories of sitting on a table with another co-founder. Both of us were former consultants. This was before Farmdog. Both of us former consultants, which basically means you can prove any idea to be awesome. You can also prove any idea to be absolutely horrific. And we went down a few rabbit holes until I actually founded a drone startup back in 2000. I guess it was just 2014 or so, where the whole thing with drones, if you remember, you'd fly a drone, it would follow you while you're doing mountain biking or running some sort of action sport. You'd upload the video to YouTube, get a bunch of likes, and everybody's happy. That's really, I think, the first true startup that I worked on, kind of post consulting, was on that. And so, yeah, went through a bunch of rabbit holes, and that's actually how I got to Farmdog eventually, even though we don't do anything with drones either back then or now.
And so, as you were kind of going through that process, you came across the kind of set of problems within, the agriculture space, pests, and so on. What would that kind of early MVP for Farmdog look like?
So Farmdog actually was founded as a soil moisture sensor company for irrigation management. I was living in Israel at the time, and Israel is always going through a drought, and also conversing with farmers and agronomists in California. This was 2015, I guess. By that point, California was in that really bad drought at the time, and so every farmer pushed us toward irrigation management. And what we saw back then was you had soil moisture sensors, but they're really expensive. I'm talking $1,000 plus for a soil moisture sensor that everybody also told us were not very accurate. And so we saw the situation where people were spending a lot of money on something that wasn't that good. This is also the time when Arduinos and Raspberry Pis were coming out, and we said, you know what, we can, instead of making one sensor that is really, really good and expensive, why don't we just make a bunch of sensors that aren't that great, but once you get a bunch of them out there, you can actually start to compare the different data trends across your field. And so that's how Farmdog was started, and also what we were able to raise our initial funding on. So that was our MVP, a really ugly sensor that we even skipped over the wireless part of it. The first pilot that we set up, I think we had 2 or 3 miles worth of cable running through this the poor farmer's field, running through his fields.
And so, did you get buy-in for those early users, those first farmers? Particularly if you're showing up with a large roll of cable.
So first of all, hide that large roll of cable. Don't take that out of the car, and only do it.
Right.
Only do it after the farmer gives you approval. It was two things. The first thing was really, this was a need for the folks that we were working with. We got to this idea because farmers said, help us with irrigation management. And so we knew that was a need. The second thing is I'm a big believer in, I don't know if you're familiar with the red paperclip theory or story, whatever it's called, where it's part urban myth, part real, where a guy took a red paperclip, I think it was somewhere in Canada, and said, how far can I get ahead by just trading this red paperclip for something, and then that something for something else? And eventually, I think the guy ended up with a house or something, right? Because he traded the
Yep.
red paperclip for rubber bands. Of course, media helped him along the way, but that's something that I really believe in. And so, in addition to starting off with something that our end target really wanted, we started off small. So our first quote unquote customer client was actually a local garden in around Tel Aviv. Not agriculture, nothing fancy. Nobody would ever know what that place is, but we could say, hey, we've got a pilot running. Then we took that and then we went to a small grower and said, hey, we've already got this one pilot running. Can we do it with you, right? And eventually just kind of started trading up to larger and larger or more appropriate clients and users.
Yeah, I'm a big kind of believer in a similar kind of approach myself. I've said in previous roles, I only kind of build to get me to the next demo, the next trial, and then if you get to the next one, then you just spend a weekend scrambling to actually build the thing that you've committed to,
Exactly.
basically.
Exactly.
And so once you kind of got to a level where I suppose, what was the moment where you said, "Oh, we actually have something here. We're getting to some form of product market fit."
Well, with the sensors at the time, we never got to it. That was a big aha moment. The
Right.
idea there, the long-term vision there was collect a bunch of data, eventually tell Farmer James, hey, Farmer James, this is how much you need to irrigate to optimize your yield, and this is going to save you water, etc. The challenge there was we needed a lot of data because the sensors themselves didn't really give us any actionable insight. Even if it said you have 8% soil moisture or 12% or whatever, we didn't know how to translate that into something that the farmer should do. And so when we went to the farmers, we'd say, hey, farmers, will you pay us to put a bunch of sensors in your field? We'll collect data over the next couple of years. And after that, we will hopefully have something smart to tell you. And as you can imagine, people said, go away, good luck and go
Sure.
away. And so that's when we realized we were bumping up against a big issue where, on the one hand, we needed data, which is fine. You can get data. The challenge was we needed to build hardware to get that data, and hardware is expensive. And so that was one aspect. And then we learned a few other things along the way that were specific to agriculture that allowed us to make the pivot. One, that day one value prop, you got to give a day one value prop to your users, which is funny to say in hindsight, but people want to get something in return for what they pay for. And then in terms of adoption in agriculture, hardware is definitely tougher than software. And then you really need to align with the process that the grower is already doing. And so with the sensors, we were asking growers to adopt something new in their day-to-day process. You're going to have a tough time doing that. And so that's when we took a step back and said, okay, we still have a bunch of the money left that we raised. We still have a team. Let's figure out what the next thing should be. And so we went back to our growers and agronomists, said, hey guys, help us help you. And that's how we landed on what Farmdog eventually became.
And so today, it's that kind of software first kind of approach. Do you still incorporate sensor data from third parties, or is that just something you've kind of moved away from completely?
We do. And the reason being, one of the challenges in agriculture is there's a lot of different data layers out there. And there's lots of great companies, and a bunch of us have come out and done a great job of solving for X. The problem is the Venn diagram in agriculture to get to something that is actually sustainable. And I define sustainable in agriculture along three levers. One is environmental, of course, that we all think about. Two is financial, right? You can't ask a grower to do something if it's going to hit his or her bottom line, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to put food on the table. And then three is social and cultural, which is, if you take a look at some of the corporate farming, as folks like to say, the larger farming, that's really upended a lot of rural communities. If you compare what those communities were 50 years ago to today, they're nothing like it. And so from that aspect, we wanted to stay on that sustainable route, but solve for all of those aspects. So when we did that, we went back to our growers and agronomists, and that's really where we aligned on the pest and disease aspect.
And so so pest disease in its own way then affects those different elements of sustainability. I mean, it definitely clearly affects the financial, right? Like
Yep.
if the pests are eating the crops, that's definitely hitting the bottom line.
Yep.
But yeah, I suppose could you say more about how it affects those other kind of areas of sustainability?
Yeah. So from a financial aspect, today, various studies show that I think like 80 or 90% of pesticides don't even hit their target. And a pesticide is an herbicide against weeds, it's a fungicide against fungus, and an insecticide against bugs. That huge amounts of it are just really thrown away. Why? Because folks aren't spraying their fields at the right time. You're not spraying in the right places, and so that's just a wasted amount of money. Two, if you're not using it at the right time, you're not protecting your crops the right way. So we're spending about $80 billion, 80, worldwide on pesticides. It's still losing 20 to 40% of our crops to pest and disease, which is around $500 billion worth of lost yield. So when you're talking about a hit to the wallet, those are pretty big numbers. So there's your financial aspect. Environmental we talked about, and then social, cultural. At the end of the day, the folks that are spraying, these tend to be the farm workers, the farm hands, the folks who are moving up and down, and really really following the seasons. So lower income folks, and so you get into the issue of these things are being sprayed, pesticides are being sprayed around people that sometimes aren't as protected as they should be, just physically, right? If we all know PPE today, but PPE back in the day was really, a lot of it was about farm work, amongst other industries. They don't necessarily have the health insurance that they need or the health coverage that they need to help them out when there are issues. And then you also just have lots of different areas where the water becomes tainted with pesticides. The land becomes tainted with pesticides, right? And so the whole issue of pest and disease really touches on all three of these pillars.
And so when Farmdog is fully deployed for a specific farmer, what are the sorts of kind of savings or advantages that that farmer gains from your
Yep.
system?
So it's a great question, because what we've just talked about right now, that's not the value proposition that I tell a grower and agronomist. When I go to a grower and agronomist, I say, hey, use Farmdog, and you're going to save time, because now you've got a digital history of what was out in your field. You're going to improve your communication, because now instead of calling somebody, texting somebody, you can actually send out a report out from the field. So really the digitization process that you and I have been living with for the last 15 years, right? But when you look at agriculture, about 50, 60% of growers are still keeping their records or in-field records with pen and paper, right? Which blows my mind, because that's the enabler for everything. You have the analog to digital transformation, which then you have the analog to digital value prop, which is the same across every industry, right? Whether I'm doing agriculture, whether I'm looking at small business accounting from 20 years ago, whatever it may be, that value proposition is the same, but we just haven't hit it yet in agriculture. And so until you hit that, all the longer term benefits that are the sexier benefits, right? These are the ones that you and I love to read about, talk about, and say, hey, with a bunch of big data, you'll be able to know exactly when to treat your fields, etc. We can't get to those until we actually provide easy to use tools that folks just digitize your day to day.
Yeah, no, I'm a big kind of believer in everything you said there. I think I might not have mentioned earlier, but I actually grew up on a farm in Ireland,
Okay.
and Dad had the big kind of old account, basically adapted from like what an accounting firm would have used like in the
Yep.
1990s, like a big kind of paper manual, and that's where he'd jot things away, and like literally he was the only one who could read it. It was
Yeah.
just all scrawls,
And
and that was the state of play there, and it sounds like it's pretty much the same today for a lot of farmers.
it's very, very similar. And that's one of the frustrating parts about the industry, to be honest, is a lot of money, and this gets us more to the sustainability aspect of it as opposed to just the day-to-day aspect. A lot of money is going into more of the moonshot solutions, or more of the 15, 20 years down the line sort of solutions, and we all hope that they'll come about 5 years from now, which is great, which is awesome. Those are needed. The problem is folks aren't really focusing on kind of the day-to-day, just initial digitization, which to me is the enabler for everything.
And I suppose, is that gap a talent gap in terms of, the people who are typically building those kind of software digitization tools just
Yeah,
aren't really aware of the kind of opportunity, or is there something else going on?
it's a few things. So, I think the first wave of ag tech, which was started probably, folks will disagree with me completely, but I'll say that the first recent wave of ag tech, which is about 5 or 6 years ago when Climate Corporation was purchased by back then Monsanto, today Bayer. What that resulted in was a bunch of really smart folks from the Bay Area saying, "Oh, look at all these dumb farmers with their old, outdated means of operations. Let us give them some sexy technology that we know from another industry, and we're going to solve all their problems." And so that first wave built a bunch of tools that a farmer looked at it and said, "What the hell do I do with this?" Because
Right.
there was no communication amongst boards. So that was that first, in my opinion, kind of the first failure. The second failure, in my opinion, is that money did go into ag tech software from a lot of VCs, but the problem has been that the return on those is longer, right? You got VCs that were used to investing in a company and seeing a few exits within 2 to 3 years, right? Here, obviously, in agriculture, 2 to 3 years is nothing because 2 to 3 years is really just getting set up, essentially, right? You know this more better than I do, probably.
Right.
And so a lot of companies that raised a few years ago haven't had those exits yet, and so a lot of VCs have pulled away from investing in some of the ag tech. Now, what did that lead to? That led to the traditional agriculture companies, the chemicals companies, saying, "Okay, let us try to fill the void." The problem with that, and they did that for two reasons. One, they said there's a void. Two, if you look at what's happening in the industry, a lot of the traditionally powerful companies that could differentiate on their chemicals are now becoming commoditized. And so you've got these multi-billion-dollar companies that say, "Okay, how do we differentiate moving forward?" And one of the ways to do so is through services. And today, being 2020, you hope that services include digital. And so they're starting to build out digital software platforms. The problem with that, and this gets to your question on is it talent, is you know these are chemicals companies. They're not software companies, right? And just like in every other industry, when the incumbent who's not digital, who's not a software company, tries to build software, they tend to not build very good software, right? It's much easier to bring software to an industry instead of industry to software. But what that's creating is in a situation in which some of these softwares or many of these are being given away for free because they're backed up by multi-billion-dollar companies. Growers say, "Okay, I'll try this one for free because I also get it as a rebate on the seeds that I purchased, whatever it may be." And then it causes a lot of the smaller companies, such as ourselves, startups, to have to compete with that. The bigger challenge with that is,
Yeah, no, I mean, please go on. But yeah, I suppose like that kind of fundamentally is a fundamental challenge to the go-to-market. And you
yeah,
even have the situation where these large agribusinesses are directly competing with each other, and they're, by on purpose not allowing the data from one system to, interact with
right,
the data from a competing system. And
yep,
so it's very hard to kind of, have the ecosystem speak to each other, I guess.
exactly. Which it would be one of those things. I think in other industries, I would say, so be it, go for it. Right? It's competition is competition. I'm a capitalist at heart. Like, hey, if you can do it,
Sure.
go for it. The challenge or the problem here is these companies that, not only in my opinion, but you hear it from farmers, from agronomists, aren't building solutions that are actually solving problems, right? And so that's the challenge, is that not only do they tend to control the distribution channels, but they're pumping bad products through those distribution channels, which is why you still have 50 to 60% of growers saying, "The hell with it, I'm going to keep using pen and paper. My digital solution isn't actually solving what I needed to solve."
Yeah, and we see that this kind of form of, I suppose, digital lock-in in other areas. Obviously, that some of the large tech companies have been, in front of Congress over the last 6 or
Yep.
12 months, but they're generally playing in a space that is much less monopolized than agriculture in the U.S. at least.
Right.
And so then, because of those challenges around kind of go to market, because a lot of these agribusinesses have often 80, 100, 150 year, like behind them. And they have these major kind of channels of various types. They're sponsoring the local, prize bull competition
Right.
and so on. How do you at Farmdog think about go to market? Is there
Yeah.
any kind of challenges or innovation that you see kind of in that space?
Yeah. So we've done a few things. And for us, product is very aligned with go to market. And so, first of all, when we built out our product, we made it as easy to adopt as possible. And from that, I mean as simple as both Android and iOS, having a invite a teammate to join your team, being able to download the app and starting to use it right away without needing to do an enterprise style demo like many other folks do. So that's number one for us is really just I'm in LA. I obviously can't be right now in Alabama. I can't be in Ohio. I can't be in Montana, wherever it may need to be. So let's at least make it as easy as possible for somebody to start using Farmdog. So that's number one. The second aspect that we've done is aligning ourselves with other distribution channels that do exist. So we've been working with John Deere, for example, for almost 5 years now. Part of that integration in terms of data layers that you mentioned, so folks can pull in their field boundaries into Farmdog, get started right, pull in their field boundaries from John Deere, get started right away. But we also work with many John Deere dealers who they present Farmdog to their growers because they're trying to bring digital to their growers. And so really latching on to allies that have these strong distribution channels already. And then the third aspect is the data part. And so as we get more and more users, our data starts to push out actionable insights. So we can actually build out hyperlocal efficacy for our users, meaning, okay, Farmer James, you've got 10 fields, you're growing corn on all these and using the same pesticide. Let us show you what the efficacy is across these fields. Field 5 seems to underperform all the other fields. Red flag, go figure out what's going on over there. So those are the sorts of things that we're pushing out. And it really builds into the go-to market because we're really pushing for word of mouth. A lot of agriculture technology adoption happens through word of mouth. If my neighbor's got a good field, let me figure out what my neighbor is doing, and then hopefully they share what's going on. And so trying to build up that word of mouth. The second aspect, which is more of the physical, is really trying to get to a bunch of the conferences and events that are really important. Unfortunately, the last 6 to 9 months, just like in every other industry, those have been few and far between.
And it's great that people can get up and running so easily, kind of using that product-led growth strategy that is all the rage in Silicon Valley right now
Right.
after the adoption of things like Slack and Zoom, et cetera.
Yep.
Once they're kind of ramped up, is there any sort of kind of specialized knowledge or training needed kind of to get the absolute most out of the product, or is it fairly intuitive all the way along?
The hope is that it's fairly intuitive throughout. I would be lying if I said nobody has ever emailed me and said, "Hey, how do I save my visit?" Even though there's a save button visit, there's
Sure.
always user training required. But we do try to make it as simple as possible to move. And really, we just like you said, we look towards Slack to help us figure out how it is. That invite a friend, if you will. That was Slack influenced. The way our pricing works, that is Slack influenced. So really just try to make it as easy as possible.
And so, because you mentioned it there, so how do you monetize Farmdog?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, we're a data company. Long term, really what I want to happen is Farmer James comes to his Farmdog platform. We tell you, James, watch out. In 3 days, you're going to have a whitefly outbreak. Your treatment options are A and B based off the market value of your crop and cost of your treatment, including, of course, sustainability built into that as well. Here's your ROI for your different treatment options. Once you choose what to do, we're also going to help you purchase that treatment because we're going to connect you directly to your retailer. We're going to help you get sustainability certification because we can see the activities that you've done in your field. We're going to connect you to insurance. That's a long-term vision. The challenge there is we need a lot of data to get there. And so if I back that up in terms of the monetization today, it's Slack pricing. It's per user fee per month, but it's a freemium model. So about 80%, 90% of what you can do in Farmdog actually sits in the free tier. Really because we know that to get past that operational value proposition, which is what I call the digitization gateway in agriculture, To get you past that, we need a lot of data. And so we're trying to bring more and more people on board so that then we can aggregate and anonymize that data in order to push out insights.
And so one of the things you kind of mentioned, like insights, another way I can think about it is like nearly like a decision layer, right? So
Yep.
data is great, but often, and people who ever use a business intelligence platform, people are given KPIs and all those kind of things, but without the context to know what to
Right.
do with that data, often people kind of struggle. And so that kind of decision layer, is some of that already in the product, or is that also kind of more of future vision?
Yeah, so we released the first versions of that, I would say, this last growing season. And so really if you look at the if you look, big data, right, you've got descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. We're definitely still at that descriptive part, but the descriptive aspect of it are things that folks have never seen in the past. So at the simplest level, we can take our users' data and graph it. What I mean by that, if you're, for example, if you're a grower and you've got issues with whiteflies and you're going out to your field once a week to see the severity level of whiteflies, we're going to graph that out for you so you can see how that moves over time temporally. We can then overlay on top of that which treatments you applied in the field. And so that now, you can make that connection between, okay, here's my severity scale and here's what I actually applied in the field. So that's something that we released about a year ago. In addition to that, some of the other things that are in our alpha mode, and when folks reach out to me, I can share this with them, is that hyperlocal treatment efficacy that I mentioned, hyperlocal outbreaks and alerts, and work, for example, very closely with the U.S. Department of Agriculture down in Florida on building out regional pest and disease management. And so pulling in a bunch of data from the area, and then eventually would be pushing out dedicated alerts so that if Farmer James and Farmer Liron are our neighbors, we're both growing the same crop, we're both doing the same thing, but we want to make sure that on a region-wide basis, we're as efficacious as possible. Farmer James may get an alert, hey James, use pesticide X. Farmer Liron may get an alert on the same day it says use pesticide Y. Why? Because that's going to make sure that these pesticides continue to work. It's going to make sure that we use the bare minimum amount of pesticides to ensure sustainability as well.
And you kind of mentioned sounds like a lot of progress over the last 12 months in particular. I suppose, what are your next kind of couple of year goals? What are the major milestones you're trying to reach?
Yeah, so there's a few, and it's really, putting aside getting more users, obviously, it's really on the data side and productizing that data so that we can give those actual insights to growers. So I mentioned the hyperlocal treatment efficacy. I want when my grower or agronomist goes out and identifies that they have whitefly severity level high, we are going to be able to push out to them, hey, buddy, we see you have whitefly severity level high. This is what you used last time. It's not working as well as it used to in the past, or it's not working as well compared to other folks in your area. And so, number one is helping them make a better decision on what treatment to use. The second thing that we're going to be pulling in or starting to add is additional data layers. So today, I mentioned that we're integrated John Deere. We have weather data integrated, satellite imagery data integrated, pesticide label and soil information integrated. We want to pull in more data layers in there so that the grower the agronomist can make a better decision. So that's the second aspect. And then the third aspect that I'm really excited about is on the sustainability side. So today we all have to talk about sustainability. It's very hard to define what
Sure.
that really is, right? And on the agricultural side, it's also really hard to certify sustainable activities. And this goes back to the fact that 50-60% of folks are still using paper records, right? And so we're building out. At the end of the tracks, there's this new sustainable economy that many of our farmers aren't going to be able to participate in because they're not going to be able to show that they are sustainable. What we've built into Farmdog within our data infrastructure is the ability to go in and essentially have breadcrumbs on our users' activities. And so instead of saying, hey, this user was sustainable because he applied pesticide X instead of Y, we don't want to get there because we're never going to know what that decision making process was like, right? For all I know, Farmer James made the right decision when he chose X instead of Y. What we're able to do is to go through and look at those breadcrumbs on what led to that decision. By that I mean, did Farmer James visit his field twice every week or whatever the sustainable amount is? Did Farmer James look at weather data before he made the decision to apply pesticides or fertilizer or irrigate, right? That in and of itself is a factor in sustainable decision making. Did Farmer James look for beneficial insects out in his field, right? So there's all these factors that we can look to our digital platform and essentially check the boxes for all these, and then say that James is or is not sustainable along whatever spectrum that is, that whether it's the end consumer requires, and frankly becomes whether the CPG companies or the Cargills of the world require.
And so in essence, whether it's something like organic certification or the specific private label, a large agribusiness CPG company certification, you can then be flexible and just be the underlying kind of proving layer for whatever the farmer wants to be certified to be.
Exactly, because the problem today is a lot of these certifications that make us all feel good when we buy that box of cereal at the grocery store, that we see all those logos on the back. They're for lack of a better word, they're kind of a house of cards. They're based on either one or two off certification processes where a certifier goes to the farmer once, twice a year and says, "Hey, Farmer James, did you do X, Y, Z?" And you say, "Yes, I did." And you hand over a bunch of papers, and then certifier walks your field and says, "Oh, things look good," but it's in person. It's only a few times per year. And so who knows what goes on throughout. The second aspect is, in addition to that, a lot of this stuff is self-certification. And so when the Kellogg's of the world, not putting Kellogg's on the spot, I just picked
Sure.
a good brand name. When the Kellogg's of the world says our growers today, sequestered 500 tons of carbon in the last 6 months, if you went and actually asked Kellogg's, okay, what's your proof of that? That proof is often missing. And so this allows folks to go in and say, okay, here are the sustainable activities. Here's the digital validation. Here's the digital validation of what actually happened in the field.
Understood. And in terms of like the data collection, I suppose, are you collecting all the data points necessary to kind of roll up to those kind of sustainability pieces, or I suppose it sounds like the plan is to do so. And is that also taking in things like sensor data, the app itself, satellite imagery? Are there any other kind of data
Right.
sources that you're planning to collect?
So what we're pulling in is a piece of the puzzle, right? I'm really excited about it, but I'm not going to pretend that Farmdog is going to be the be all end all of sustainability
Sure.
certification. It's just a piece of the puzzle in terms of the activity, in terms of being able to show the activities that the grower did him or herself out in the field. In addition to that, yes, sensor information, yes, the soil sampling that folks are doing, all that rolls up into that ultimate certification, whatever that certification is called or is utilized for. But we bring a very significant part of that because we bring essentially the actions that were taken by the grower.
Fantastic. And then I suppose like broadening it out to some of the other things that are affecting us in the world, how has kind of COVID affected either your views generally on agriculture and the company as a whole over the last, now 6 months?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, from the agriculture perspective, I think it has pushed digitization a bit more. Right, a lot of agriculture is relationship based, and yes, we would all love it to be that way. But if you can't actually visit the person, and that person needs to purchase something, whether it's from you or from somebody else, you got to go towards digitization. And so that's something that I think has definitely been a plus for the industry in terms of pushing that forward. The second thing you'd asked previously about talent, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's because unfortunately people may have been laid off from their previous companies or something else. I like to believe that it's, COVID has sort of reawakened people's desire to quote unquote help the world, however you define helping the world, right?
Sure.
Um, and so we've definitely had a lot more people reach out to us in the last 6 or 7 months about joining up in terms of joining kind of the company's mission. And then the third thing, if I look at kind of the agriculture industry further up, not just growers but the supply chain, it's forced a lot of people to take a look and ask whether the way that our supply chain is built today is actually the right way, right? We all saw the food shortages and things that were in the very beginning when people were hoarding food or whenever you only had a few slaughterhouses that were supplying all the US and a few of them had to close down because of a few COVID infections and we had shortages. I think it's causing a lot of people to re-question that consolidation that has been driving a lot of the industry the last few decades. So whether we'll see some more fragmentation has a bad connotation, but whether we're going to see a little bit more deconsolidation to make sure supply chains are closer to where they need to be to who they're feeding, I think folks are asking the questions again.
Another kind of macro trend is around the move to kind of more plant-based alternatives. Yeah, I suppose, how do you think about that, and how it intersects with Farmdog?
So it's a very interesting question because moving to plant-based it's right. If I take even a wider viewpoint and just climate change, sustainability as a whole, right? All this stuff, you push one button and it's going to affect 20 other things, right? Unfortunately, we don't have the
Yeah,
luxury of just doing one and hoping that everything else stays the same. And so the plant-based, for me, I have my fiance actually runs a plant-based company, and so we have these discussions at home. So I think from the health perspective, the question is, first of all, over processing, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll put that to the side. Um, but then, once you get to plant based, it's okay. Are we growing the soy in the right way? Right? Because now, if we need to grow more soybeans or whatever else, is that going to push us more to monoculture? To have the plant based meat alternatives. Does that keep us in that monoculture world? So that's one aspect. I think the second aspect, the more positive one, is if more plant-based doesn't just mean meat substitutes, but rather it means that, hey, I've got this cornucopia of colors on my plate because I'm eating a whole bunch of different fruits and veggies. I think that's amazing because that helps bring the world nature back to its equilibrium, which, if you go to way back in the day, you didn't need to use as much pesticides as we need to use today, right? Because you had different plants performing different functions out in the field, and protecting one another essentially for, if I'm going to romanticize it. Whereas
right.
today you've got monocrops and nothing's protecting them and you need to spray everything. So if I bring it back to Farmdog, I think that could be potentially the biggest factor on the pesticide side. The question is how big can that get, right? It's, if you compare the percentages of acreage of corn and soy to specialty crops, I mean, it's night and day, right? So even if we convert another 100,000 acres of corn and soy to specialty, which is fruits and vegetables, how much of a difference is that going to make? Probably not a lot.
Right. And I was just thinking about, the company. Sounds like you moved around a lot to, like, in terms of both geography as well as kind of business idea. But I think you started Farmdog in Israel, and you're now kind of based out of LA. So what drove that kind of move? And I suppose your kind of general view on startup location, things
Yeah.
like remote work versus the kind of the value of being in a specific place.
Right. So when we founded Farmdog in Israel, I was flying transatlantically once a month, if not more. Talking about climate change and sustainability. But, it wasn't
Sure.
sustainable from a personal health perspective. It wasn't good because I was just always jet lagged. From an environment perspective, it wasn't good, and from a business perspective, it was horrible because I would get invitations from a group of growers in the middle of Kansas and saying, "Hey, Liron, we've got a group of 50 folks here. Today's Monday, and when we're meeting on Thursday, can you come speak to us?" And technically, I could get there, but one, it would at that point it would cost $4,000 or $5,000. It would take me 36 hours to get there. By the time I got there, I was dead tired, and it would be a waste of time. So we missed a bunch of opportunities, either because I wasn't at full level at 100% when I got there, or I just never got there. But that goes back to agriculture being a personal relationship based industry, right? So it needed to be there, and the fact that I wasn't there was just hurting everything. So that was one thing that drove it. The second thing that drove it, I mentioned my fiance, her plant based company. LA is really where her target market is, right? This is where a
Right.
bunch of the plant-based companies are out here, and so moved out to LA. And I was trying to optimize. For me, it was important to optimize moving back to the States for three things. One is being close to growers or agronomists, just agriculture in general. Two is being close to tech talent, and three is being close to investor money. So LA has a stereotype of being Hollywood, etc. But 50 years ago, LA was the number one agriculture producing county in the United States. So there's a very strong history here, and not just history, but if I just drive 45 minutes out of the city, I'm in farmland. Strawberries, tomatoes, lots of different things around here. So that from that aspect, LA made sense. Tech talent, investors, et cetera, also made sense. It's still definitely a challenge because many of our customers are in the Midwest or in Florida or wherever it may be. And then from a tech talent perspective, everybody's moving towards remote. I still very highly believe in people working together. I just think you get more done, more brainstorming done. You can, it's much easier to say, "Hey, James, what are you working on?" And you flip your computer around and, we can talk throughout the day, whether it's about work or whether it's about the basketball game or whatever it may be. And, I just think that's really, really tough to replicate. Not just that, but, my experience, my R&D team is based in Israel, which is a 10-hour time difference. And so you can imagine if I wake up, even if I wake up at 6 a.m. in order to be ready for like a 7 a.m. sync, it's already 5 p.m. their time. So
Right.
there's that huge, huge disadvantage. Now, of course, I've got folks in Montana as well, so it's an hour difference. That's not as bad. But to me, it gets back to nothing can replicate face to face. I think that just humans are social creatures. We need that. Maybe we don't need it 100% of the time, but I think having it a good amount of the time is really important.
Yeah, and I've worked at 100% kind of remote companies for the last 4 years, and we would still have to have in-person retreats multiple
Yep.
times a year to actually formalize strategy, and I think like after a certain amount of time, sometimes people want to be left alone, but like you
Right.
absolutely need these very, very intense moments. Just like having a physical whiteboard is
Yep.
still 100x better than the digital one. So yeah, I'm a big believer in everything you said there. So yeah, this has been a great conversation. Before I finish up, is there anything I should have asked you about but did not?
That's always a great question. I think for me, agriculture can play a huge role in climate change and sustainability in general. I think it's important for the industry to get the nuts and bolts down right before having kind of the big eyes towards what it can be. I think we still need to figure out what the nuts and bolts are to that to build a foundation into the great things that the industry can eventually reach to. To me, that's the biggest takeaway for me in the last 5 years in the industry.
Great point to end on. Well, thank you very much, Liron.
Yep. Thank you, James.